You're listening to Climate Now. I'm James Lawler, and today we're discussing the impact of Putin's war in Ukraine on energy sources, prices, and the global shift to clean energy. We're speaking with Amory Lovins, who is co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Rocky Mountain Institute. Amory, you have co-authored a paper with Kingsmill Bond, Oleksiy Tarenko, and a few others that has just been published on the RMI website. That's titled From Deep Crisis, Profound Change, an assessment of the dynamics accelerating the global sprint away from fossil fuels in the wake of Putin's war. I'd love to start with another energy crisis, actually, which I think sets up the argument in this paper quite nicely, which is the energy shocks of 1973 and then 79, between which, Amory, you published a very famous paper in Foreign Affairs. There is a graph that is in this most recent paper on Putin's war, which paints a very striking picture of the trend in, well, I'll let you describe it. What is the trend in world oil demand, kind of before and after? What does that picture tell us?
Well, from the mid-60s to 1973, world oil demand was on gradual exponential growth. But after the 73 and then the 79 oil shocks, which raised price even more, that growth curve was just hammered flat. And what happened was really quite striking in historic retrospect. Demand for oil stagnated in the decade after 79, even though economies kept growing. European demand for oil never regained its 79 level. When the oil crisis broke in 73, OPEC, the oil producers cartel, was supplying half the world's oil, or a quarter of the total energy in the world. But let's just look at what happened in the United States. In just 8 years, from 1977 to 85, U.S. oil use fell 17%, while the economy grew 27%. Oil imports fell 50%. Imports from the Persian Gulf fell 87%. So America proved able to save oil faster than OPEC could sell less oil. And the cartel's sales dropped by nearly half, breaking its pricing power for a decade. Per dollar of GDP, U.S. oil use fell 35%. That's 5.2% a year. And such a pace could eliminate Europe's fuel imports from Russia in 4 years. Just to put that in perspective, it's really fast savings.
Mm-hmm.
But now the U.S. and much of the world could rerun that play, only more effectively. And not just for oil, but also for gas and coal, because we have now much more powerful ways to save all fossil fuels cheaper than buying them. The cornerstone of our U.S. response in 1977 to 85 was making new automobiles more efficient by 7.6 miles per gallon. How'd we do that? Well, on average, each car was driving 1% fewer miles on 20% fewer gallons. And 96% of the savings came from smarter design, only 4% from smaller size. Then by 1984, we progressed further. The entire light vehicle fleet got 62% better fuel economy, while vehicles became lighter, no less peppy, and a lot safer.
So just to underscore then the point you've made so far, this massive flattening, just hammering flat of an exponential growth curve, at least in the US, was driven mostly by efficiency improvement in the automotive sector. Is that right?
It was in all sectors, but the kind of cornerstone of the whole effort, the most important part, was making just new cars 7.6 miles per gallon more efficient.
Wow.
Well, now we're not just incrementally improving car and other automobile and light and heavy truck efficiency. were going electric, and then they used no oil. And last year's sales of four or more wheel passenger vehicles worldwide were 6.75 million. That's over 8% of total sales. And both those numbers doubled in a year. This year, we're expected to have 10 million new electric vehicles in the world. Now, the US lags. We have 4% market share last year of electric vehicles. The only big one that's worse is Japan at 1%. But China was 13%. Europe was 17%. And by the end of the year, they were 26%. And then, of course, there's Norway. Their new auto sales were 65% battery cars, 22% plug-in hybrids, 6% gasoline hybrids, and just 8% traditional gasoline or diesel-powered vehicles. Well, that's a good existence proof to aspire to, but certainly getting up to at least Chinese and European levels of electric vehicle buying would save a whole lot of oil from Russia. And this automotive transformation is sweeping the world, driven by policy, by economics, and frankly, by customer enthusiasm, because good electric cars are simply better. You buy them because they're better, not because they're efficient. And quickly, this is spreading, of course, to trucks and buses. And the more efficient we make vehicles, at the same time we make them electric, the easier the conversion to electric drive becomes, because you need fewer of the costly batteries, less electricity and less time to charge them, less charging infrastructure, and you're also saving critical materials.
So, so could you compare in size or in magnitude? How can we compare the 1973 energy shock with the shock that's occurring as a result of Putin's war today? Are these comparable? How do we make that comparison?
The energy shock we're experiencing right now is very comparable in size to the oil shocks of the 1970s, but they differ in four main ways. That now we have much cheaper alternatives, particularly from solar, wind, green hydrogen, and batteries, all on steep learning curves of higher volume makes the cost lower, and then we buy more, and then they get even cheaper. Mm-hmm. Then we have these solar and wind technologies much further along their S-curve of deployment than, say, nuclear was in 73. So they're much larger, more mature industry, and they're everywhere. Any country can buy or build them. Solar and wind, of course, are available anywhere, and ordinary market actors can deploy them quickly. So Vietnam, for example, recently put in mainly rooftop solar power equivalent in output to half their dominant coal power in 1 year. 70-odd% of it in December, and most of that in the last week of December. Just incredible. It'll take the grid a while to catch up. And then, of course, there's necessity that we now have this imperative to get to net zero and energy security, not just clean and healthy. Mm-hmm. So as we add energy security to the previous imperatives for climate protection, public health, and affordability, those four together, I think, will overcome incumbent resistance a lot better than we have seen in the past.
So let's talk about then what this means for Russia and fossil fuel use in general. What this would likely mean. So could you describe Russia's production of fossil fuels today for the world? How do they
No,
rank in terms of fossil fuel production? What's the magnitude of that output?
Russia is the world's biggest exporter of oil, of gas, and of total fossil fuels. Indeed, in 2020, they were twice as big an exporter of fossil fuels as Saudi Arabia because the Saudis only exported oil, but Russia also exported gas and some coal.
Hmm.
So Russia added up to 15% of international energy trade, and they're now being cut out of markets, which of course leads to a classic supply shock, just like we had in the 70s.
Hmm.
When Europe and North America and probably Japan, as has already happened for coal, stopped
Mhm.
buying Russian fossil fuels, that doesn't mean that those fuels vanish from the market because there are some other countries willing to buy them at a steep discount because no one else wants them. So India is buying a lot of Russian oil for which their refineries are set up. Uh, and they're getting a discount upwards of $30 a barrel for taking it off the Russians' hands.
Mhm.
Well, that doesn't make the oil disappear. It means it frees up other oil India was importing from elsewhere, and that can now serve other countries because the source is acceptable. So that sort of thing in India and perhaps in China could help reduce the price shock to the world. It isn't like in the Arab oil embargo where uh, the oil, in a real sense, did disappear
Mhm.
from the market, and you had a crunch between reduced supply and uh, largely unchanged demand. So they
Mhm.
collided and the price went up.
Right.
Of course, the price is up a lot, but a lot of that is driven by gas because Russia reduced storage in Europe over the previous winter. It controlled a lot of that storage and got away with reducing storage, reducing flows to Europe to set the stage for its war.
Hmm.
And that raised energy prices a lot and really uh, started making the whole energy system ring like a bell. And of course, now that uh, we're seeing embargoes emerge on buying Russian fossil fuels, particularly in Europe, but already in the US, which buys a lot less of them, uh, that is going to be quite disruptive, but not for long,
Hmm.
because we're already seeing dramatic policies emerge led by the European Commission and by Germany. And these are not uh, policies to, revive declining and moribund nuclear or go drilling in the North Sea. To be sure, some backward energy policies like Britain's do include some of that, but they're not part of the EU anymore. Uh, and most of it is a strong emphasis on efficiency and renewables, which are
Hmm.
exactly the things to do if you want to get off Russian fossil fuels quickly and affordably. Anything else you can do in supply is likely to be too slow and way too costly.
Mhm. So
Now,
let's talk about some of those specific things that, or maybe you were just turning to this. But what did we see in the immediate aftermath of the invasion in the policy arena?
the European Commission uh, got into gear quickly, uh,
Mhm.
and this is understandable because Russia's uh, 11% share of global fossil fuel production is especially focused to Europe. It's a fifth of Europe's total energy, and it's much more for some European Union countries. But that means that Europe is now funding Putin's war with $400 million a day in hard currency just to buy gas. And altogether, Russia's earning over $1 billion a day for oil and gas and coal. So now Europe is loath to buy those fuels or other commodities. Traders don't want to accept them. Ports don't want to admit them. Dockers don't want to unload them. So, why should you pay over $1 billion a day to fund Putin's war and make up for the blockage of the central bank's funds held in foreign banks? In fact, they could replenish that very quickly with $1 billion a day. So that means that Russia is going to have to sell its gas east to China. It'll take at least 3 years to finish another pipeline. And by the way, it would displace coal. So if you didn't leak a lot of gas along the way, that would be good for climate. But they would take the price China offers, not the price Russia wants. And as some foreign policy experts have remarked, China doesn't have friends, only vassals. It's not clear that Russia wants to be in that position, but it wouldn't have a lot of choice. And meanwhile, 3 years is an awfully long drought in their gas cash flow. So the way things are shaping up now, Europe is likely to buy 2/3 less Russian gas by this fall or winter than it did previously. And by sometime around next summer, probably no Russian gas. And the oil purchases will also phase out rather quickly, mostly over the next year or two, with some dribs and drabs tagging along over the next couple of years.
Hmm.
So Russia's going to lose its big market and its influence in Europe.
Wow. And so, I mean, do you think that Putin just didn't consider this at all? Like, what was going? I mean, this is obvious. There's a lot more that you wonder about Putin, but on this particular point, like, did he not think this through, or what did he think would happen here?
Well, whether through his own view of the world or because of bad advice he got from a very limited circle of advisors, I think it's clear he did not expect his central bank funds abroad to be frozen. He did not expect European or allied cohesion, and he didn't expect that they could do without his fuels. But they now feel very strongly, seeing the horrors in Ukraine, that they will not keep funding his war. They will do what's necessary to get off his fuels, and they need his fuels less than he needs the money.
Now, there have been some articles I've seen, recently, that because of the increased energy prices, Putin's war has sort of paid for itself, and that the amount that they're earning through selling the fuels that they are selling is making up for the decline in demand from countries who refuse to buy them. Is that something you've seen, or no?
I haven't run the numbers, but that sounds broadly plausible in the very short run, and that's exactly why there's such strong consensus in Europe that we need to stop buying this stuff and funding his war. And what they'll buy instead doesn't require supply from anybody. The sun will shine and the wind will blow regardless. You aren't buying a fuel from anybody. And by the way, this also very much speeds up achieving their strong climate goals, in which they've been the world leader. So, in terms of energy independence, helping stop the war, long run energy security, a deflationary economy instead of inflationary as you go from fuels to renewables, and the climate and public health goals, this is a win on every possible front. And the only loser is Putin.
I wonder if you could. I know that you just did this in a fashion, but I wonder if you could characterize the attitude toward fossil fuels in Europe before the war and then after it started, and particularly in Germany, because I think that in the paper you paint a pretty striking picture of how policy shifted in a very short period of time, as a result of the invasion?
Before Putin's war, Europe was trying to save fossil fuel gradually, mainly to protect the climate. Uh, but there was a lot of internal opposition, uh, and Germany did end up letting the uh, Nord Stream 2 uh, pipeline get built uh, even after the Russians had started bullying and made it clear that this was a security risk to depend ever more on Russian gas. Uh, but Putin's war changed all that very abruptly, and German policy shifted more in 10 days than it had in 10 years. The notion of Chancellor Merkel that by having this business relationship with Russia at the cost of more German dependence on Russia, you could somehow have some leverage or influence uh, toward improving Russian behavior turned out to be false. And the German government swiftly brought forward its net zero target for the power sector by a decade to 2035. They're tripling their rate of renewable installation even before Putin's war. And now it's going to go even faster uh, and have a lot of extra efficiency in using energy. The
Hmm.
leading German utility called E.ON and Fortescue in Australia, more or less overnight, created a partnership to deliver up to 5 million tons a year of green hydrogen to Germany to help run heavy industry. And the European Commission, with strong German influence, published a plan to cut Russian fossil fuels completely out of the European energy system in 5 years, and to cut imported Russian gas by 2/3 this year. But that actually has since sped up even more. And I credit Germany quite a lot for helping to push that, because they have shown historically how to do efficiency and renewables very systematically and effectively. And I think part of the result, just to look at the proof of the pudding, is that their wholesale electricity price had only half the rise in last December's volatility that France did, and German wholesale electric prices have undercut the French ones for all but 1 year since 2007.
Wow. And so, where do you think? What do you think the trajectory of the war will be?
Well, it's really hard to foresee the war. You could end up with regime change in Kiev, regime change in Moscow, a long grinding stalemate, uh, some kind of face-saving settlement, uh, or possibly escalation to weapons of mass destruction. It's really hard to assign probabilities to those, because so much depends on what goes on in Putin's head, which is pretty inscrutable. Uh, but I think the course of getting Europe off fossil fuels is very clear. Uh, in our recent paper, we ran some deliberately simplified scenarios just because they're so transparent and easy to understand, and it's almost impossible uh, not to uh, get off Russian fuel, fossil fuel, uh, in the next 5 years or so,
Hmm.
just with the kinds of achievements and further accelerations that we're seeing in efficiency and renewables. And this will have a big demonstration effect. Even though Europe uses only 9% of the world's fossil fuel and that demand is shrinking, it'll have a disproportionate effect, because it will set higher fossil fuel prices in places like Asia, that can save fossil fuel just as well as Europe can.
Why
It
will
will,
it mean higher prices?
well,
Sorry.
because countries like Japan and China will be competing with Europe for the same loads of liquefied natural gas.
Oh, okay.
And that drives up the price. They compete at that price. It's
Hmm.
therefore more lucrative for them to save gas or gas-fired electricity, and those
Hmm.
savings free up Asian gas to go to Europe.
Hmm.
Europe will be finding solutions other countries can adopt, particularly in renewables and grid integration. That's already been happening.
Hmm.
The extra capacity that European ambition will get built for green hydrogen, for renewables, for efficiency, can serve markets and speed learning and training, save fungible fossil fuels, drop prices faster everywhere. So the infrastructure all over the world is going to improve faster.
Hmm.
Uh, Europe is strongly incentivized to encourage everybody's energy transition and to deploy its expertise and capital to do that elsewhere, as German companies are already doing.
Hmm.
And of course, it breaks the narrative that energy transitions are way too slow.
Right.
Uh,
Or
the
expensive.
notion that Europe could reduce Russian gas imports by 2/3 this year would have been laughed out of the room a few months ago, but now
Hmm.
it's what's happening.
Right.
And I think this breaks a lot of metal log jams and counters the narrative from the fossil fuel industries that transitions have to take half a century.
So how do you think this is going to impact the clean energy transition in other parts of the world?
Well, the need to deploy renewables and the opportunity is even greater in the global south, which already buys the majority of the world's renewables.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think these events in Europe are going to speed up an energy leapfrog in the global south. It's interesting that the sales of oil fueled automobiles peaked in 2017, not just for the world, but also in China.
Hmm.
Uh, and what is coming right at us in all parts of the world is faster renewable deployment and more efficiency. So before Putin's war, the consensus of the best forecasters was that the COVID-19 pandemic, which crushed fossil fuels but accelerated renewables to handle all the growth,
Hmm.
that would result in fossil fuels bumping along a rocky plateau for most of the rest of the decade and then slowly declining. But what we now see is the likelihood of a much steeper decline driven by all the uh, forces that we've been discussing. Uh, and I think this will show up everywhere from super efficient buildings to rapid spread of heat pumps to green hydrogen to very efficient use of energy in industry and of energy intensive materials.
Well, thanks so much, Amory. This has been fascinating as always to speak with you on these topics and really appreciate you making this time for us today.
My
Thanks.
pleasure. Thank you.
That was Amory Lovins, co-founder and chairman emeritus of the Rocky Mountain Institute. That's it for this episode of the podcast. To listen to other episodes, watch our videos, or read our articles, visit climatenow.com. To get in touch, email us at contact@climatenow.com. We hope you can join us for our next conversation. Climate Now is made possible in part by our science partners, like the Livermore Lab Foundation. The Livermore Lab Foundation supports climate research and carbon cleanup initiatives at the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, which is a Department of Energy applied science and research facility. More information on the Foundation's climate work can be found at livermorelabfoundation.org.